was born in the state of Tennessee. I grew up the first 7 years of my life in Obion County, Tennessee, where my mother's family was from since the Civil War. And at the age of 7 in 1949, we moved from Tennessee to Kansas. And one of the reasons we moved to Kansas was because several of my father's World War II Army friends were in Kansas and encouraged him to move that way. And so he closed down his business in Tennessee and started it up again in the little town of Plainville, Kansas, north of Hays, Kansas. And we started from there. And we lived there for 7 years. And we got kind of hit like everybody else by the big drought of the 50s that hit Texas very, very hard and hit the rest of us as well, and we moved to Huntsville, Texas. One of the main reasons we moved to Huntsville, Texas was to make sure that there was a college for my sister and I to attend. And she's about 3 years younger than I am. So we moved here, graduated from Huntsville High School in 1959, and immediately enrolled at Sam Houston after working all summer. My best friend and I, Charles Jones, had worked for 2 summers on road construction. We cleared a bunch of land that is now I-45 right through Huntsville from the wind farm down below Goree. And I worked on the span bridge, original span bridge that went over State Park Road. So, that was that. We worked on other road construction projects in between the contract on I-45. So we started college in the fall of 1959, and I laughingly say, well, Charlie and I, except for military, never left college again. And Charlie's a retired professor at Stephen F. Austin University. Graduated from Sam Houston in 1962. I took the 3-year route. I stayed in college.
Yeah.
Started graduate school at TCU. When I moved to TCU in the fall of '62, I lacked one ROTC course. So I took my last ROTC course at Texas Christian University.
Okay.
And so I was commissioned at TCU, but since I was a distinguished military graduate and the records caught up rather slowly, I did not receive my regular Army commission until 10 May 1963. At which time I was given 9 months of active service without pay to stay in graduate school.
Wow.
Which incurred another year commitment for my Army career, which was fine. So in 1964, I left TCU and went to Fort Benning, Georgia, reported in on January the 31st, 1964, started the Infantry Officers Basic Course.
All right, before we go into military, so before you went to college, like growing up, just what were some hobbies that you had growing up in either Texas or?
Well, I guess I always dreamed of being a cowboy.
Uh-huh.
So the minute we moved to Kansas, I started pestering for a horse, and I got a Shetland pony.
Okay.
I don't care for Shetland ponies, but he taught me an awful lot. I must have been the 20th kid he trained.
Yeah.
But anyway, horses, and yes, I got to work cattle, and yes, I worked as a cowboy.
That's very cool.
And I can get into that later, but that was always a dream. In my earliest birthday pictures, I was in some kind of a cowboy uniform for my birthday cake. So I think that's was always a dream. And you can look around, and I retired from showing horses in 2013, the year before I retired from work.
That's very cool.
So,
Get
and
off.
for a non-pro, I wasn't too bad.
Yeah. You mentioned you had a sister.
Yes.
What does she do now?
She's retired too. She was a school teacher for 30-some years.
Okay.
And she's retired and lives here in Huntsville. But she's lived around. She taught in Angleton area, Brazelsport area, for most of her teaching career. And after she retired, she went to Kentucky and taught for a few years up there. because our hometown was on the Tennessee-Kentucky border, and I was born on the Tennessee side, and she was born on the Kentucky side. She's never forgiven me for that.
Yeah. What did your parents do growing up?
I'm going to start with my mother. My
Okay.
mother was one of two children in her family. She was born in 1908. Her mother, my grandmother, was orphaned at the age of 5 in Reconstruction, Tennessee, and lived hand to mouth, she and her older sister. So she had a pretty tough upbringing, and was, quite frankly, my grandmother was one tough woman.
Yeah.
And they say that her enemies would see her coming, and they would walk across the street to get away from her. My grandfather was a deputy sheriff and chased the Night Riders during the Night Rider conflict on Reelfoot Lake in the first part of the 20th century, 1905 to about 1909.
Wow.
And my father said one time, he's very easy to get along with, but don't ever cross the man. Apparently he was a pretty tough fellow.
Yeah.
He was one of 5 brothers out of 11 children that grew to adulthood. And my great-grandfather was a Civil War veteran, as was my great-grandfather on the other side of the family. And so mother was the first member of her family, extended family, of all of the 11 to go to college.
Very cool.
And she taught her first year at McMinnville. And I don't know whether she taught civics or English or French or Spanish or whatever, but she was also the girls' basketball coach. And in 1929, she won the Tennessee State Championship in girls' basketball. So, you know, she'd be really thrilled this year.
Yeah.
With Caitlin Clark.
Yeah.
So that was kind of my heritage. My father left home very early. He and his father didn't always see eye to eye. And he traveled the country.
That's very cool.
He worked wheat harvest. He did this, he did that. In the winter of 1927, he worked on road construction out of East Glacier Park, Montana, into the park. And in 1948, he took us out there and showed us that spot. And that was just absolutely amazing. He left that job and went to San Francisco and enrolled in the Army and was stationed at the Presidio in San Francisco from 1927 until about 1930, when he was then stationed at Fort Sam Houston until he left the Army in 1932. And he made lifelong friends in the Army. One, Fred Wurzbach, Ferdy as we all called him, was one of those, and Ferdy made a career of the Army and retired in '57. My father always wanted me to make a career of the Army.
So he was a big influence in you joining the Army?
Oh, you bet.
Yeah.
You bet.
When did you kind of figure out that you definitely wanted to join the Army, or is that was what you wanted you wanted to do with your life?
Ever since my cousin J.D. went in the Army and was in the 82nd Airborne Division in the 50s. But as I grew older, even more so, when I understood about my cousin Chester Finch. Chester, I found out, was in the 82nd Airborne during World War II and made every jump the 82nd made.
Wow.
His son went to Vietnam after I came home. And I don't know whatever happened there. But, you know, when Chester was in, then J.D. was in, then Margie's husband Glenn was in during the Korean time. He didn't go to Korea. I mean, forever my family has served.
Right.
That's just expected of us. My son was in the Florida Guard.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he was on the Florida pistol team in 2000 that competed at Little Rock, Arkansas at the Air Force Base.
That's very cool.
International competition, so yeah.
Yeah. Okay, moving on. So you talked about influences. Were there any other influences that made you want to go, let's say, the commission route instead of like the enlisted route? What made you kind of want to go to college, gravitate to college?
My mother insisted I go to college.
Yeah.
And I wanted to go to college. Everybody who graduated from our high school, the group I ran with, we all went to college. Some of us went to Sam, and some went to UT. A few went to A&M. But I mean, we really, it was just expected of us. And of course, my high school English teacher's husband was a math professor at Sam, and she had just graduated a year or two before. I think I was in her class. It was her second year to teach full time, and she's still a friend. We still have dinner together. She was a great influence on my life. All of my high school English teachers were influences. Miss Burton set a standard. Miss Hatter. I mean, I was so fortunate to have marvelous teachers, and Zena Mattingly Smith was right up there at the top of them. And of course, she was young and beautiful, and everybody in class was in love with her.
Yeah.
But so and I remember one time while I was at TCU, I got called to go see Miss Burton when I came home for Christmas.
Mm-hmm.
Now this is my high school English teacher, drama teacher, speech teacher. Marvelous, marvelous lady. She said, I have an opportunity to go to Tyler Junior College. Do you think I can teach in college? Well, you talk about a backhanded compliment. So she taught at Tyler Junior College until she retired. And the last time I visited with her, she was 93 and still is flamboyant and marvelous as ever.
That's awesome.
And she died a year or two later.
That's too bad.
So, yeah.
Okay, so talk to me about your experience in college. What did you major in? And then you participated in the ROTC program at Sam Houston. Tell me a little bit about that, and then tell me about the program at TCU as well.
Okay. When I started Sam Houston, my father thought I should look at engineering.
Mm-hmm.
And he's a watchmaker and a jeweler, and if you can do 5 columns this way and 5 columns that way, and just write all the numbers in on those columns, he can look at it and go down like that and write the total score.
Wow.
I didn't have that skill.
Yeah.
I got the literary skill from my mother.
Yeah.
And so my sister got the mathematics skill, and she was the math teacher.
There you go.
So, but I started, and I went through the freshman orientation, and what is the old gym. I'm not sure what's in that now. You know where the ROTC building is?
Mm-hmm.
That's the old gym.
Okay.
And where the ROTC building is now is where the athletic dorms were.
Yeah, that's AB3 now, so
Yeah.
it's an academic building. And
Well, that big gym down below, whatever it's used for now,
it's cheered now.
is where we had our freshman orientation, about 1,000 of us.
Oh, wow.
And the PA set played out, and Dr. Lohman could not be heard. The dean of the college, Brick Lowry, stood up. W.E. Brick Lowry. And he said, I don't need a microphone, and he did the rest of the orientation without a microphone. And nobody couldn't hear him.
There you go, yeah.
Then we went off to our areas, and so I was falling in that guideline, and I tried mathematics for a semester. My college algebra teacher had done his student teaching when I was in algebra in high school.
That's funny.
Another one who recently retired, I don't know if he's still alive or not, Dr. Tommy Davis did his student teaching while I was in high school.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, so I was a math major for one semester.
Okay.
And I enjoyed my English class more than anything else, and my history class second. And I had already considered being a history major. And Mother and I had gone and visited with the then department chair, Dr. Lee McGee, who was a member of our church and a friend. And Mother was completing her master's degree at the time. And we sat out there one night, and Dr. McGee started asking me questions about why I wanted to be a history major. Well, history was just always kind of easy for me. But he started putting up all of these road signs, construction ahead, can you put up with this? Can you do that? Can you do that? Maybe you really don't want to be a history major. Well, I paused on that and ended up being a history minor.
There you go. Yeah.
And became an English major because I had a marvelous freshman composition teacher who really inspired me, and I did quite well after that. So, and I always loved the literature, and I love philosophy, and I don't see that there's an ounce of difference between philosophy and literature in many, many ways. And
right.
when I was at TCU, one of my professors used philosophy in his Victorian literature classes, and somebody went to the philosophy department and asked the department chair, he said, I would like to take a course in phenomenology. What would you suggest? He said, take one of Dr. Copeland's literature classes. He does a better job than we do.
Yeah.
So they're just two related, so I like that. I'm kind of an amateur philosopher, I guess, and I took the first two philosophy classes that were offered at SAM in 1959, 60, and 60, 61.
Mm-hmm.
And I took Introduction to Philosophy and Ethics, and it was taught by Dr. J. Stuart Allen, who was a professor of English and a graduate of Vanderbilt. We got taught at Sewanee. So, it's all tied together, and then I took every course I could from Dr. Stewart before he went off to University of Michigan on a postdoctoral scholarship.
Yeah.
Or fellowship, as they would have called it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's natural, it's ideas.
That's very cool. So tell me a little bit about the ROTC, your involvement with that, and kind of what you did.
When I came to Sam Houston, we still had mandatory ROTC.
Right.
We had the second largest, we were Fourth Army at the time, we had the second largest ROTC department in the Army. Second only to A&M.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think there was that much difference in our size. I mean, so I started out, I had some really, really good instructors. And I'm going to have to bring up one of my Vietnam points here in a minute.
Okay.
But, I mean, the people we had at that time were basically World War II veterans.
Right.
And I worked in the ROTC supply room, which was in the bottom of the education building at the time.
Okay.
And what we did is we kept all of the ROTC uniforms and clothes and all, and issued them every year.
Right.
And for 20 years after I worked there, I could look at somebody and tell them what size they were wearing, basically.
Wow.
I mean, that's what we had to do. And the man that ran it, Mr. Martin, was a retired NCO. And he had come to Sam Houston as an ROTC instructor. And he'd retired. We lived next door at the time. And his daughter was a year ahead of me in high school. And his wife was the cashier at the Texan Cafe when it was the Texan Cafe and not the New Texan. He was very influential in my life, very, very influential. He told me, he said, on the ship home from Germany at the end of the war, I gambled and won $2,000, and I haven't gambled since.
There you go.
Little things like that. But one of the things that he impressed on me was discipline, discipline, discipline. And of course, being in the education building and being on the basement floor, across the hall, Sergeant Sam Wingfield had the armory where all of the weapons were stored that we'd have to come pick up for drill when we used weapons.
Right.
And 2 or 3 times a week, we had a visit from one of the education professors, Colonel M.B. Etheridge. I don't know what you know about Colonel Etheridge or not.
Don't know much about him.
Oh, then you need to go take a lesson on Colonel Etheridge.
Okay.
Okay? They don't have a
Know
street
that.
named after him for nothing. Colonel M.B. Etheridge, and I've not seen this documented, so it's apocryphal. Colonel M.B. Etheridge, at the time, was considered the second most decorated soldier of World War II. And he and Audie Murphy knew each other. They were both in the 3rd Infantry Division.
It's very cool.
And Colonel Etheridge would come down and tell war stories.
Wow.
We'd listen.
Yeah.
So, you know, it was a very fortunate experience. And again, encouragement to stay with the program. Some of our people who graduated ahead of me in high school went on active duty, went through basic training, and got in the reserves, and then came back to college.
Right.
Which was a good plan, because they picked up, when they got their commission, they picked up 2 or 3 years
Of service time.
of service time, which paid off down the road at retirement time. My best friend in the Army was one of those that happened. He served as an enlisted man for 3 or 4 years before he went to OCS. But so that was a good experience. But I had good instructors. One of them was a Captain Royal, who soon became a major. He was an armor officer, and this is long before your generation. But he had a fencing scar on his face, right through here.
Wow.
Now, you have to understand, of that generation, and from World War I through that time, a fencing scar was a mark of distinction. And there were some people, particularly in Germany, who had them done to have them. Intentionally. The Burgermeister of Friedberg, Germany, had a fencing scar. I don't know whether it was from fencing class or not, but anyway, Major Royal had a fencing scar. And I don't know a lot about his career. I wish I knew more.
Mm-hmm.
But he smoked Longchamp leather-covered pipes. And so when I got ready to go to Vietnam, I got a Longchamp leather-covered pipe in honor of him.
That's awesome.
And Major Royal kind of put me into something, and I learned a lot about the Longchamp pipes. At the end of the war, a lot of the wood that was used to cut out pipes was imperfect. And so Longchamp bought all of these, got their own stamp on the stems, and covered them in leather to hide the faults. Well, over the years, they improved, but they were extremely popular with the GIs at the end of the war in Paris and in France. And so they were quite popular, and they stopped them in the late 70s, but they were a popular PX item throughout the U.S. Army.
Wow.
So, it's kind of a side story that you don't even get about
fact,
the war. So that was one of my influences, and we had some really good NCOs, including a Sergeant Floyd. Sergeant Floyd was a big, tall man with very dark hair, very, very imposing. He was a Master Sergeant E7, and that goes back to ranking. I had my first sergeant when I was a company commander was a Master Sergeant E7, and he'd been an E7 since the Korean War, and this is from the 50s, 53 until 66.
Wow.
I lost him because he got a chance to get promoted to E8, but he had to go to another company to be the first sergeant there.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, that was, and that's what happened. So I arrived in Germany in 1964.
Okay.
I report in, I'm assigned to A company. I'm walking in to go to A company. And coming down the stairs is Sergeant Floyd. I mean, you know, he's going to be looking over my shoulder and telling me, Lieutenant, you did that wrong. Lieutenant, you did that wrong.
Yeah.
And then he was transferred out about 2 weeks later to get promoted. Had to go to Gelnhausen, and I was glad he got promoted. He was a fine NCO. So, crossed paths. So, but I had some good officers. I had Major Saul Fisher, who I saw in Germany and again in California on my way to Vietnam. Major Barkley, who was probably one of the greatest influences. We had some really good professors in military science, and the one they had when I left I didn't think was that good. So I won't say anything more about him except that for very special reasons the Army sent him to Saudi Arabia.
Wow.
And if you can't figure that out,
Interesting place to go, yeah.
you what?
So that's an interesting place to go. Interesting place to go.
You can't drink in Saudi Arabia.
Oh.
Expect 5 and go get him a bottle a day. Seriously.
There you go. That's
Yeah.
one way to fix a problem.
So they sent him. I've always smiled about that. We didn't care for each other. He had a son who could never serve on active duty from basically leg defects at birth. And he forced that kid into ROTC
Wow.
and waived the physical requirements.
Wow.
And I just did not think that was right. But anyway.
Okay, moving on to TCU. You said you spent a year in their ROTC program, and then you did
I
your
spent
graduate
one
there?
semester.
One semester?
One semester I took the LICE course. We had a new professor of military science, Colonel John Swango, who had just returned from Vietnam.
Okay.
We had a personnel sergeant who'd been in a car wreck and was basically disabled. But he was a personnel sergeant, and so even though he used crutches, the Army kept him in the job. And he was one of the most important influences in my preparation to be an officer. He told me one time, he said, "Cadet, you're an English major. And everywhere you go, they're going to want you to be an S1. Don't ever be an S1 or you'll get into a routine that you'll never get out of."
Good advice.
So anytime I had to write something, I always put mistakes in it so they could correct them and then realize they didn't want me to do it.
There you go.
Anyway, so I was never an S1. So somehow I got off in the maintenance side of it. I was a rifle platoon leader in Germany.
Okay.
And there are two phrases that are important about the Army. DLJO and other duties as assigned.
Okay.
Okay? Dirty little jobs officer.
Okay.
Another duty, well, one of my company duties, other duties as assigned, was company motor officer. And I took it seriously. And in the time I was a platoon leader, we never had any major mechanical problems on field or alerts or anything else. And I got along very well with my motor sergeant. I spent a lot of time in the motor pool. Dave Sager, it's time to rotate and go home, back to the farm in Illinois. And the motor sergeant, Master Sergeant E.A. Pappy Carter, walked up to Colonel DeMa's office and said, "Colonel DeMa, I want Kirkland to be the next motor officer." And that's how I got to be a battalion motor officer.
There you go.
Sergeant Carter was the first E8 in his MOS. And he was a big man. And he told me one time, "Lieutenant, I love the Army. Anybody who said anything bad about it, I'd just whip their ass in a New York second." He said, "I don't feel that way anymore and I'm retiring." But Colonel DeMa had invited him up and offered him the battalion sergeant major's job to E9.
Wow.
He told Colonel DeMa, he said, "Colonel DeMa, I've got more important things to do than pick up cigarette butts." Oh man, what a ship he ran. I mean, we had one of the best maintenance battalions, not because of me, but because of him and our warrant officer. And Mr. Vinn was one of those special men. he was a CW3 at the time. In World War II, he had worked on the Burma Road, building the Burma Road.
Wow.
And he had gone home, and he was running a junkyard in Peoria, Illinois. And that November, I don't know, Cuban Missile Crisis or whatever it was, 61-ish, whichever crisis it was. And Kennedy said one more time, ask not what your country can do for you, rather ask what you can do for your country. He sold his shop, came back on military duty, and served until he retired.
Wow. And
we lost him because he got promoted to CW4. You know, great for him.
That's incredible.
You know, he was an amazing, he was a big bear of a man. We were, I'll get to that later about working with the British Army, but he grabbed him. We went up and the general said, this was working with the British, we were up at Sinaloga at their training site, and division commander came up, and General Kirwan was a little shorter than you are and was tough as rawhide. And nobody messed with General Kirwan. And I happen to know because I was nominated for his aide-de-camp, and Nelson Lehman, who had been his aide-de-camp, said, don't worry, you're not going to get it, you're too tall. So I had a good interview, and every time he came to our area, I seemed to be the one reporting to him. And Mr. Ben was talking to him, and the general said, and the brigade commander was right there beside him, and he said, did brigade come down and inspect your tracks before you came up here? Yes, sir. They came down and looked at them and told me how pretty they were, and never did open an engine compartment. And he said, General, and he put his arm around the general. Only Mr. Venn. And of course, Kirwan just knew that that was somehow okay. There wasn't, you know, just anybody else that had been in the brigade stockade. I mean, it was just hilarious. I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing. And the brigade commander who had done the inspection was standing right there.
Wow.
So yeah, we had some good times too.
That's funny.
So, you know, you just, you know, you meet wonderful, wonderful people in the military. And you meet people who, you know, like my first battalion commander. Guess who was a member of his wedding party?
You were?
No. General Douglas MacArthur.
Wow.
I mean, yeah. He was a 46th graduate at West Point. His father was a brigadier general, and Colonel Dumont did not get the star, which he so richly deserved. And my opinion was he was too smart. They were afraid of him. That happened to Pete Dawkins. This happened to a few others. His last assignment was in a think tank on the future of nuclear tactical weaponry in the Army, and across the river from the Pentagon. Yeah. But he'd had a nuclear prefix, and he'd done a tour of duty in the Solomon Islands working with the Atomic Energy Commission, and those kinds of assignments in those days could hold you back. Plus, he had a military intelligence assignment during the Korean War.
Incredible.
But, oh my gosh, he was, oh wow, what an officer. We had a reunion in 2000 and he was there. And I'll tell you what, if he had said, buckle up guys, we're going, every one of us, every 25 or 6 of us at that reunion would have buckled up and gone.
Yeah. That's awesome. All right. So after commissioning, tell me a little bit about your IBOLIC, and then, you know, Ranger School, just like some stuff that you may have learned, some stories that kind of impacted you. And
fortunate you've got all the stories and all told tales, by the way, so you're welcome to draw on those. But in order to get into Ranger School in those days, you had to pass the PT test with a score of 300 or whatever it was.
Okay.
And it was a different PT test from what you take now. And you had to pass a swimming test. And I remember the swimming test indelibly. Fort Benning, Georgia, in February at 32 degrees in a swimming pool in full combat equipment. And you have to jump in and swim across the pool. And then you have to jump in again and go to the bottom and take off all your webbing and gear and come back up and swim out and all that stuff. And it's icy.
Right.
So that's one of my memories. The PT test, it was just a typical PT test, you know, for the time. And it's not the calisthenics type they do now. It was a practical test more than anything else.
Right.
But we had 3 of our classmates, international students, who ran Olympic speed miles in fatigues and their combat boots, which were lighter weight than ours, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
Osni Majoub from Tunisia, and Tony Ling from Britain, and there was one other, and I forget where he was from. Tony Ling was an alternate on the 1960 British Olympic team for the 1500 meter. And Majoub could run like that all day long. It just, you know, he was, anyway, so that was one memory.
Mm-hmm.
The hand-to-hand combat pits.
Okay.
Well, I was smart enough, or at least I thought I was, to take judo at TCU the semester before I went in the Army to get in shape to be ready to do what we needed to do.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I earned a brown belt in one semester, so I was doing pretty well.
Okay.
So we got into the hand-to-hand combat pits, and my first partner was a little heavier than I was, and he tweaked a knee that first day and had to withdraw. I hope he got to recycle. So they gave me a new partner, Ron Ray from Cordele, Georgia, which is right down the road from Fort Benning and over on 75 now. And Ron and I were about the same size and about the same athletic ability. And our hand-to-hand combat instructor was Sergeant First Class Mixon, Mixon. Sergeant Mixon's nickname was Cold Steel Mixon. You could not please him no matter what you did, so to speak. And if you threw somebody and didn't throw him hard enough, he'd get after you for not throwing him hard enough. And if you threw him too hard, he wouldn't say a word. And Ron and I got 2 or 3 plus spot reports from him in the hand-to-hand pits. That's like, that just didn't happen. Mm-hmm. So we were quite thrilled with that. But and Sergeant Mixon will come back again and again in my experiences. So Ron was stationed in Germany as well, but he was stationed at Mainz. He was in the Airborne Brigade, and I think it's the 8th Infantry Division. George and I were at Ray Barracks. George Wilkins, another classmate from Ranger School. We'd periodically meet at the von Steuben in Wiesbaden, and we're known to do parachute landing falls off the bar, in the piano bar at the Wiesbaden, at the von Steuben. And as one night we were there, and I ran into Major Fisher, my ROTC instructor from SAM. So, you know, it's that kind of thing. But later, when I was ROTC TAC officer in 1969 at Fort Benning, when I was teaching military science, I saw Sergeant Mixon again. Command Sergeant Major Mixon with the 101st on his right, and he was the Command Sergeant Major of the Airborne School at the time. And in his career, Sergeant Mixon went from Ranger School to the 101st, to Airborne School, to the 101st, to Ranger School. That was his career path.
Wow.
And he retired a Command Sergeant Major. He's in the Ranger Hall of Fame, deservedly so. and his son is a retired lieutenant general.
Quite the reputation.
So anyway, then we had 2 British officers, 2 Indian officers, 2 Canadian officers, an Italian captain and his sergeant major, Osmi Majoub from Tunisia, and 2 or 3 other international officers in our class. Tony Ling, whom I mentioned a minute ago, Anthony F.S. Ling, retired brigadier, British Army. His father was a major general commanding the East Anglia district of England at that time. And he was a possible connection when I trained with the British Army, but he was off at a car race racing cars. But he was superb officer. The other British officer, well, he was not British, he was a Scotsman.
Interesting.
Jeremy Mackenzie, Clon Mackenzie. He was the second son of a second son. His father was in the army, and he was born in Kenya. And his father was lieutenant colonel at the time and invested very well in coffee plantations in Kenya and made millions.
Wow.
And Mackenzie graduated from Sandhurst in 1961. And he went to the he went to Asia, and he was in the Brunei Rebellion in 61, 62 time frame, 63 time frame. So he was out there for about 2 years patrolling, and then he came to Ranger School. So he already had all this combat experience under his belt.
Mm-hmm.
And he had that no-nonsense, clipped Scots accent. You know, he was not the kind of guy you'd smile and go drink a beer with.
Mm-hmm.
He was all strictly business. So after the first couple of weeks, we went down to what we call Camp Gooch, which is now Camp Darby,
Right.
south part of Fort Benning. And our first patrol, we came back, and the NCOs, the instructors, we call them lane graders, always gave us a debriefing. So the old sergeant was going to be really, really sharp. And so the first thing he said was, "Mackenzie, what'd you think of the exercise?" In his clipped Scots accent, he said, "Sounded like a den of elephants in the forest." That was the end of the debriefing.
That's pretty funny.
But our Italian captain, when we were at Benning one night in the barracks, they had the 2 cots. He put 2 foot lockers lengthways and out, put his hands on the cots and his feet, his hands on the foot lockers and his feet on the lower rung of the cot. You know, you have the cot up here and then the bed here,
Mm-hmm.
and he had his feet up here. And he did 25 push-ups, touching his chest on the floor, and then back up.
Wow.
He's a pretty strong fellow.
Mm-hmm.
His job, he was in what was called an Alpine force, and in the winter they were in the mountains, and in the summers they dove off the cliffs.
Wow.
And sergeant major, so he was a mountain climber already. When we got to the mountain climbing part of it, the sergeant major run up there like a mountain goat, and he just right up behind him. So you don't think about that. Well, but that same night he showed us the holes he had from being shot in Korea.
Wow.
In 1980, the United States turned over Lebanon to NATO.
Mm-hmm.
There was a gray-haired NATO colonel in charge of that group. And I'll swear it was the Italian captain.
Yeah.
You know, small. Well, you know, I got a report in the 80s that Mackenzie had been killed in the Troubles,
Mm-hmm.
but that wasn't true.
Interesting.
So George and I were talking one day, and so I said, "George, let me see what I can find out." And I'll get to George in a minute. So I looked it up. Mackenzie stayed in the Army. He moved up the chain of command. He was from the Queen's Own Highlanders. He commanded the battalion in Hong Kong. He was in the Troubles, and he had all of these assignments during the Troubles. In the 1992 to 95, 6 time frame, he was aide-de-camp general to the Queen.
Wow.
He was as a lieutenant general. He started the Rapid Reaction Force in Europe for the Allied forces, and his last job was deputy Allied commander, European forces, and he was in charge of the 52,000 troops that went into Central Europe.
Wow.
And he retired, General Sir Jeremy Mackenzie.
Yeah.
Probably one of the most distinguished military careers in England since Patton's foe.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so moving through.
Let me tell you about George.
Okay, go ahead.
I can do that in Ranger School or later, but
Okay.
George and I were in Ranger School together.
Right.
We were friends, but we weren't quite that close at that time. When we were, my Ranger buddy was Joe Carpenter. Anyway, when I arrived in Germany, after jump school and all of that, to the 1st Battalion, 36th Infantry, George Wilkins was in C Company and I was in A Company. So George and I became fast friends after that, and continued until he died. He's in Arlington now. And Joe Carpenter went up to the 2nd of the 36th at the Rock and Kirschgorns. So we were all around, and the one thing, when I say 1st of 36, we were at Ray Barracks in Friedberg, Germany, 1964 to 66. At that time, Ray Barracks was one of the most famous casernes in all of Germany, because Elvis Presley had been stationed there.
Say.
Elvis Presley had been stationed there.
Oh, wow.
And all the old sergeants who were still there said, he was a good soldier. Well, he'd sung at the Melody Bar, and he'd sung here, and he'd done this, and he'd done that. And you go there now, and then going into Friedberg, there's a big sign about with Elvis cut out. And you go to Bad Nauheim, there's signs about Elvis.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they're still relishing. Elvis was here. But the caserne is totally closed now, just rotting.
Mm-hmm.
It's a shame. It's a damn shame. But anyway. So George retired as a colonel in 91, and he was commanding the recruiting brigade for 5th Army at Fort Sam Houston.
Oh, wow.
So,
That's awesome.
and he died in 19. He had a bad heart, and he always had complications from that. And
Okay.
he was one of my dear friends. He was the best man at my first wedding, and was kind of one of my dearest friends for life.
That's awesome. That's what the Army's for, make friends.
Oh yeah.
Lifelong friends.
Well, I have one from Germany who lives down in the Webster area, Larry Reams. He came over. He was one of the younger guys.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
That's very cool. All right, so moving into Vietnam a little bit more.
Sure.
So your train up. So kind of when you found out you were going to be going to Vietnam, how you prepared, or how the Army prepared you to go to Vietnam.
Quite
just kind of
frankly,
talk
the
about
Army
that.
didn't prepare me at all.
Really?
The Army did all the preparation, and but I got no special preparation to go there. I have to go back to Germany. We were in the Cold War.
Right.
My tactical zone was classified secret. I read it in the San Antonio Express years later. It was classified secret. I could not go to Berlin without special permission,
Wow.
because as a battalion motor officer and as an infantry officer in that battalion, we had tactical nuclear weapons. We had the Davy Crockett's. And so I was restricted because of my job from certain parts of travel. So it was nothing new. And the Pink Opals followed us around wherever they could. And that was the Russian counterparts. And I have a friend who's also a SAM graduate who was in military intelligence, and I can't tell you his name because I'm not sure I'm supposed to even tell you this. He said, I was in the equivalent on the east side of Berlin.
Oh wow.
He was one of the Americans following the Russians around, and these
That's
Germans.
crazy.
So yeah, I mean it was kind of that kind of a deal. But so I felt like, you know, I'm digressing too much.
You're fine.
November the 23rd, 1963, I was standing on the corner of 5th and Main in downtown Fort Worth. And I think I put that in that pocket folder for you.
Mm-hmm.
And I saw President Kennedy as the convoy went north from the Texas hotel. I'd seen him at midnight the night before when he and Jackie got out of the deal and went into the hotel.
Mm-hmm.
And 2 hours later, I'm back in the office talking to a student, and Art Pritchard comes in and says, President's been shot. I said, Arthur, I just saw him. He's okay. No, the president's been shot. You don't believe me? Do this. So we went down to headquarters and down to the department chair office, and all of the women professors were mascara running down their faces.
Wow.
So yeah, I saw President Kennedy that morning, and I was no further from him basically than I am from you right now. And I was amazed at how gray his hair was. You know, you don't see that in the color touch-ups,
Right.
photography, but it was just incredible. So I get to Germany, and every 6 months we have to clean our basic load because they locked and loaded and were ready to go to war.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean locked and loaded. Then that, you know, weapons loaded, locked, sitting in the tracks, waiting for the assignment.
Right.
So a lot of maintenance work.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, we really were, and it wasn't that way, but yet it was wartime footing.
Mm-hmm.
There was a movie, I forget the name of it, made about a woman who cavorted with the Americans, and they shaved her head and all of that. And I think the actress was Silva Mangani who played that role. That was Gelnhausen. That was our other brigade. That's where that happened.
Wow.
I mean, so yeah, and you had to be in certain areas. You had to be very careful. I've been to Weiden. You go to Weiden, you don't know whether the person you're talking to is a Russian, a Czech, or some other kind of spy.
Right.
And it's you know, my friend Art Pritchard, when he was there in the 50s and he was over in that area in military intelligence, they could only go out in twos or threes. They could not go out individually. It was so dangerous. So it's the constabulary days were not comfortable days for our troops in Germany.
Right.
Dr. Charlie Schmidt, the Dean of Fine Arts and Drama and Speech, his job in World War II in military intelligence was to dress in German clothing and get in the lines of refugees and identify the ones that needed to be interrogated. You know what? They gave him a life expectancy of less than 30 seconds if he ever got identified.
Wow.
Yeah. So it was not as safe as it sounds. It was safer later. We didn't feel particularly bad. We had a particularly good area. They were treated very nicely. In World War II, some guy named FDR prohibited the U.S. from bombing Bad Nauheim, which had to help us.
Mm-hmm.
Because as a boy, he'd been there with his father or grandfather to the spa treatments, and he just thought it was too pretty a town to bomb, so he wouldn't let them bomb Bad Nauheim.
That's incredible.
And it has the Roman baths. We were on the Roman frontier.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's like that ice cream in the forehead moment when I saw Gladiator and they were there. I said, that's Friedberg. I remember that. We trained in the Friedberg training area. We would go through areas where they had the dirt work, just like at Vicksburg from the Roman Empire frontier.
That's incredible.
You know, the Friedberg Castle is built on the ruins of a Roman castle. And the baths in Bad Nauheim go back to the Roman times. So, small world.
Right. So you would say you felt pretty, I guess, prepared to go to Vietnam. You expected it.
I knew since I graduated from Ranger School I was going to be in Vietnam.
Right.
when I went to Fort Benning, we were transitioning from the European theater of Germany and Europe, 7th Army and 5th Army, to the jungle warfare of Vietnam. When I arrived, most of our instructors in IOBC were just back from Germany. That was the primary place to get instructors.
Mm-hmm.
By the time I left, half of the instructors that you saw at Fort Benning had a MACV patch over here.
MACV patch.
Military Advisory Command Vietnam.
Okay.
Remember, this was before Johnson sent the big troops in.
Okay.
It was 64.
Right.
And in Ranger School, most of our instructors in the first 2 cycles were about 50-50 in Florida. As that
Wow.
changed in 9 weeks.
Wow.
And then there was old Sergeant Jordan. And he's in my off-told tales. You need to look him up. He was an
Okay.
amazing gentleman.
Okay.
World War II veterans. Went in on Omaha Beach. First wave.
Wow. First wave. That's impressive.
Yeah. And lived.
Yeah.
So,
tell me about you, like, physically going to Vietnam. So when you found out right as when you got your orders to go to Vietnam, what you were going to be doing in Vietnam.
you had no idea.
Okay.
You had no idea. You had orders to Vietnam. You were going to 25th Infantry Division.
Okay.
So, but I knew what I was going to be doing. I was an infantry officer.
Right.
I was going to have a job in an infantry battalion. Anywhere from company commander to what I ended up doing, being a battalion 4. And I was a battalion 4 for a year. Part of that had to do, I was ready for a company, but I had submitted my resignation at the appropriate time, and it had been turned down, and LBJ extended me for 18 months. So before I came back from Vietnam, it was time to resubmit.
Mm-hmm.
No, it was time to submit.
Right.
So that's when I got the extension for 18 months. So I knew I wasn't going anywhere. So I didn't care. But that last 4 or 5 months, I just told Colonel Bracey, I said, I'm resigning. I'm going to graduate school. I don't have to have command. If you've got people who need command, give it to them first. And Colonel Bracey and I got along very well, and he wrote on my evaluation that I was indispensable in that job. And you know what indispensable means in the Army, nothing.
Right.
But he said, that way, if you want to come back in, it will not be held against you. Well, the day I resigned, I came out on the majors list at 625 out of 4,400, so I wasn't.
That's pretty good.
So I was, yeah. And if I'd stayed in, I'd had another 2-year commitment, and I wanted to go back and get that doctoral degree.
Right.
And I'd called the infantry branch, and I was considering, do I stay in, do I change branches, what do I do? And they said, well, I'll see. Whenever you have over 18 years of service and make lieutenant colonel, whichever's longer. Sayonara.
Yeah.
And I asked the president of Texas A&I one day, I said, Dr. Jernigan, what should I do? And I told him, he said, go to graduate school.
Right.
I mean, there was no hesitation. So I did.
There you go.
Wouldn't change it. Only thing I wish I'd done is got my commission back and gone in the National Guard with Charlie Cone.
Mm-hmm.
You don't know who Charlie Cone was,
No.
but he retired commanding general of the 149th Armored Division.
Yeah.
And he was a friend. His wife worked at the college, and we were friends, so I could have gotten the commission back. After I finished my dissertation, I needed about 3 or 4 years just to.
Right.
So.
All right. So tell me your kind of feelings going into Vietnam, like your personal viewpoint of the war as a whole. I mean, obviously,
Okay.
you have all this stuff getting shoved on you as an Army officer. You have obligation to the U.S. But kind of tell me like your personal feelings throughout the whole situation and
Okay.
how you view the war.
No, again, there are 2 books that I think are important.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not going to give you the standard fare. the two books that I think are important if you want to understand any kind of war or combat. Philip Ross, Catch-22. And you can see the movie, because I think that is what really war ends up being like.
Right.
The other one, Graham Greene, The Quiet American, published in 1954-55. I read that when I was a lieutenant in Germany. That is the best book that has ever been written about the U.S. involvement in Vietnam. And notice the dates I said. I made a movie of it in 1958 with Audie Murphy, which is told from the viewpoint that Graham Greene uses in the novel. It was filmed in Vietnam in 1958. So it's, you know, everything you see there is the same thing it was when I was there 10 years later.
Right.
And his path when he went out to the country was up towards Tay Ninh. So I went by there many times during my year there. But they remade that movie in 2001 or 2 with Michael Caine, and they told it from the point of view of the English journalist, which was played by John Redgrave in the first movie. I don't care for that as much, but the conclusion of the book is that the naivete of the United States, and it's going to end up just like it did, and it did. I mean, it's uncanny.
Right.
I think that's more valuable than S.L.A. Marshall or some of these other things, and I've got some of the novels. I don't read much about Vietnam. I don't feel I need to.
Yeah.
And some of it's too heartrending, and I see some of the
Right.
movies, but not all of them. But Tim West's work is pretty good. And Robert Flynn's book, where he went he was a Marine, but he went back as an embedded journalist. And Robert Flynn's one of our better Texas writers. But his book on Vietnam, I forget the title of it, I've got it around here somewhere, is an excellent book on it. So I was prepared. I don't like Braniff Airlines. I celebrated the first time they went bankrupt, and I celebrated the second time they went bankrupt. Now I'm going to tell you why. We used the old 735s, and they reconstructed them, and they took out so that instead of 3 seats on the side, they had 4 seats on the side. And they packed us in like sardines.
Right.
For a 24-hour flight, California to Vietnam, with stops in Hawaii, Wake, Philippines, and Vietnam. Okay. They fed us ham and cheese sandwiches on white bread with no mayonnaise, and that was what we had to eat the whole time. So I'm not in love with Braniff Airlines.
Yeah.
Anyway, so, and that sets the stage. And I'm sitting by a lieutenant colonel, quartermaster corps. A year later, when we come back, I'm sitting by the same lieutenant colonel. But he couldn't find his quartermaster patches, so he's wearing cross rifles, and there's some people making fun of him for that. And I said, "You don't understand. Just leave him be. He's fine." But you know, that's the thing. And people who try to slack up, the last 30 days are the ones that are most likely to get killed. You either get killed in your first 30 or 40 days, or your last 30.
Right.
And that's an observation I had because I supervised the medics. Yeah. You know, supervise the vehicles, supervise the food, and you know, it was just. But anyway, I got into Benoit. They got us to Cu Chi. Went into division headquarters, G1. The brigade S1 came to pick me up.
Nice.
I looked at him and he looked at me. I don't even remember his name. He was a company commander of headquarters and headquarters company of the 2nd of the 36th at Kershgoin. And I was a battalion motor officer in the 1st of 36 HHC, we met every month at the pay window because I was the company pay officer and he was the company pay officer. So we'd been meeting for a year and a half anyway.
Yeah.
So I get back to the brigade and meet the colonel and go through all of that and go down to the battalion. And the battalion itself is gone because they're up at Daoching on an operation. So I get settled in and all that, and they get me on a helicopter and take me up to Daoching, which was an amazing place. It was the former headquarters of Michelin Rubber Plantation.
Mm-hmm.
So we were living in colonial French houses with European toilets with the chains. And I reported into Colonel Gillis, and he, former 101st Airborne, and he orients me and tells me I'm going to be the S4. I mean, I don't get any choice to say this is what I want, this is what I would like, or anything else. You're going to be the S4. Bill Mobley is leaving in 2 weeks. You got 2 weeks to learn your job. I've been a battalion motor officer, so I had a part of it already.
Mm-hmm.
But I learned everything I could from Bill in that short period of time, which wasn't enough. And in about 3 or 4 days, I found out something because Gillis just kept resonating. And I found out that my first company commander, Captain John F. Hillen Jr., was in his company when he was the company commander, and he'd been Captain Hillen's first company commander.
Wow.
And it was like, I'm back with Captain Hillen again. It was the same way. Mm-hmm. And so it was just like that. And we were off to the races. And, that was an amazing thing. But there were some others in there that, Cecchini from the C Company had been in the 2nd of the 36, and you, Joe. I mean, we're just amazing how you crisscross. And some of the enlisted men, the NCOs and all, had been in the 1st of 36 or at Friedberg, so there was a commonality that was there. And so we were on reserve, so that was a good time for me to get adjusted in. Then we came back, and a few days later we went to the Delta, and that was my first real hard operation to go through. I had to take a convoy through Saigon.
Wow.
And then go over the bridges down into the Delta, and then found out that my old ROTC summer camp company commander Major Lonnie Austin, Captain Austin at the time, not company commander, but TAC officer, was down the road a ways, and I got to go see him. He was a major now, and I was a captain.
Wow, small world.
So, you just crisscross back and forth with people you've known, this large family. You can read about my time in California at the Presidio and the Oft Told Tales. And those were significant because I met my PMS and Major Fisher again. And my father was stationed there in 1927 to 1930, and we're walking up to the officers' club and I recognized his barracks.
That's awesome.
So, in Vietnam, you make mistakes.
Right.
And if you're lucky, you live through them. But don't make it a second time.
Right.
I'm proud of 2 things. During the year that I was a battalion S4, I did not have combat loss in the vehicle, just a radiator. I did not have killed in action under my direct or indirect supervision. I did have one guy, the doctor, who was originally from Freeport. While I was on R&R, got happy and went to the forward area and jumped out of a Jeep and stepped on a mine and messed his leg up. So I did have a wounded in action. And I visited him when I came back from Vietnam on the way to ANI. So, and he was in class with Dr. Charles Monday, who's our retired surgeon here. And so I get feedback now and then when I see Charles and Jane. about how he's doing. He's done fine. So, and you say, well, you were back in the back and that, but you don't understand what we were doing, because we were running convoys right through the middle of them.
Mm-hmm.
And the fellow who replaced me, I lasted a year. The fellow who replaced me was fired in 2 weeks.
Wow.
And when I was picked up the Corpus Christi paper as I was getting ready to report in at Texas A&I,
Mm-hmm.
I looked at the obituary column, and they were getting ready in a day or two or the weekend for a funeral for Spec 4 Martinez, one of my truck drivers. I couldn't go. I couldn't go because my replacements screwed up and went down a road before the engineers cleared it. We didn't do that.
Right.
Dale would refuse, and I would refuse. Dale was my support platoon leader. And I could not go to that funeral, and I should have been there, but I couldn't face him. It was too heartrending.
Right.
You know, you have to say no. And sometimes when you say no to a colonel, he doesn't take it real well.
Right.
But we had to tell Colonel Ladd a number of times, no sir, we need the road cleared before we go down it. He was too impetuous. He was a good officer. His brother commanded his 5th group at the time. But I mean, so yeah, so but you talk about the tactics. Yeah, we had to
Right.
modify the tactics. We evolved. And as a supply officer, I got an M1 Delta sniper rifle from the Korean War era through one of my sergeants from Fort Leonard Wood, who had contacts with the CIA, and that was one of their rifles. And they wanted these grenade launchers that went underneath the, I think it's XM 144 or 148, it went under the M16, which is a sorry piece of equipment. You put 20 rounds in the magazine, it's going to malfunction.
Yeah.
You put 1 grain of sand on that action, it's going to malfunction. You know, M2 carbine, you can wrap it in mud and it'll fire.
Right.
I mean, just, but anyway, that's a sidetrack. So,
I mean, it's good to talk about those minor
well,
discrepancies.
you'll find some of that in some of the things I've put in that pocket folder.
Right.
But we had a battalion SOP. Article 15, if you put over 18 rounds in the magazine.
Really?
I think you know what Article 15 is.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. That's
Yeah.
interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, and so, and I'm an old jailhouse lawyer, so you'll read that too. But anyway, so we did that. But I had to, you had to please the colonels too. We moved to Tay Ninh. Guess whose responsibility that was to move a battalion from Cu Chi to Tay Ninh?
You.
That was mine.
Yeah.
You know, and so we did that, and we got up there, and the S3 truck with the big van on the back with fans and the maps and all of that stuff in it had a breakdown, and they were going to bring it up the next day. And Colonel Bracey decided, he and Major Yost decided they needed it tonight. So I had to go back with the convoy to Cu Chi to where the truck was broken down and it was repaired, and bring it back to Tay Ninh. And on the road into Tay Ninh, you turn, you go around this way. There's a Philcag unit here, and then there's this rubber plantation. And it was one of the most notorious places in the whole of our region of operation for ambushes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? And I'm remembering the Quiet American and Audie Murphy, anyway, on his way back from Tay Ninh and what happened to him. And I'm going down here and it's getting dark, and we're, you know what you learn in infantry school? It gets dark, you turn on your blackout lights and you ease in and around the road. Now, if Victor Charles is setting up an ambush, what's he looking for? Somebody, blackout lights, easing around the road.
Right.
So I said, guys, turn on the lights and we're going to drive like a bat out of hell and do 4-wheel drifts as we go around turns.
That's one way to do it.
And we did. And if they were there, we got them so much by surprise that we didn't get ambushed.
Right.
I got about a quarter of a mile from the gate. I said, 3, this is from a quarter mile from the gate. You better get it open or I'm going to crash through it. Boy, they were just scurrying as we came through to get it. So, you make that's what you're taught in Ranger School. You have to innovate. You have to look at the ground. You have to be creative.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and that's what a lot of the improvement in the Army in the time I was in has been decentralizing things to give unit commanders the opportunity
To make those
to
changes.
make those kinds of decisions and dramatic decisions. But that's what I was taught to do, so I did it. You know, now, I could have been in real trouble for that,
Right.
but
Were you ever actually ambushed or anything?
I was shot at in Germany
Mm-hmm.
as a lieutenant. My sergeant was killed, and I would have been killed except a weapon malfunction.
Wow.
Yeah, I've been shot at. Yeah. You can read about that in there too.
Okay.
In Germany. Yes, I've been shot at. I've been pinned down. And we were going on a patrol, quotation patrol. We landed in the wrong area, and we were trying to find our base camp area.
Mm-hmm.
And it was over here, and we were going this way. And the mortar sergeant was with us, and the major was leading us, and he's wanting to hurry. And we were moving along. We weren't really set for a combat. No, we had our weapons.
Mm-hmm.
And the mortar sergeant said, "Major, I can smell them. If we go any further, we're going to get ambushed. So let's go." "Major?" And that sergeant kind of overruled the major. And we turned around and went back and found the battalion headquarters. But I mean, you could sense it. You can feel, you know, that they were right there.
Yeah.
Yeah. But you know, we were in tunnel country, tunnel rats.
Right.
I'm too big to ever have done that. I have a friend who's a horse trainer. Shows where I showed. Terry was in A Company, and he was one. And there's one that comes out here to the Parks Museum periodically from down in Houston area.
Mm-hmm.
But I didn't have to worry about being told how much to do.
Gotcha.
You might.
Yeah.
Borderline.
Yeah. All right. So moving into coming back from Vietnam.
Yeah.
So you kind of mentioned before that you were kind of spat on. Tell me about like how you took that, how you viewed the war, how your family may have viewed the war, or friends that weren't in the army.
My first wife's father, World War II veteran, joined the 29th 14 days after D-Day.
Mm-hmm.
Fought all the way through, cleared the tunnels of Aachen. Commanded a company in the 3rd Infantry Division, 65th Regiment, Puerto Rican Regiment, in Korea. And was an advisor in Vietnam in 1962, and was up at a place called Khartoum, where I was later, and made the decision to destroy a helicopter that was down, that they couldn't get out and get people in to get it out, and thought that would ruin his chance for promotion to Lieutenant Colonel, and about 6 months later was promoted to Lieutenant Colonel.
Mm-hmm.
So I had that background at the time, and Colonel Magner is still one of my heroes. He was on the weapons committee or something at Fort Benning when I went there, and I had a letter of introduction from Colonel Swango because he and Swango were together in Vietnam in 62. I mean 61, 62. So that, you know, yeah. My first wife was born while her father was in Germany.
Mm-hmm.
You know, she was born in 44. Her, you know, her younger brother was born in Germany when they were stationed at Baumgartner in the late 50s. So it's hard to do that.
Right.
I had cousins gone. My dad hadn't gone, but when he was drafted in World War II again to go in and serve a second round, he and the 6 or 7 he worked with were all too old to go overseas. They went to APG. Daddy repaired optical equipment for the Army.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what George did, and I don't know what Birch did. And George was a mechanic, so Andy Milling was a plumber, but they were all, you know, together. And those are the ones I met.
Right.
And of course, his friend Fred, who stayed in and made a career out of it, got commissioned direct in the beginning of the war and commanded a quartermaster company in the 82nd Airborne Division, and went in on a glider and lived.
Wow.
You know, he's the only person I've ever seen that had not the airborne patch, but just the glider patch on his cap.
Interesting.
So, but yeah. Yeah. Question again.
So, how were you treated? So you talked about your family.
When I came back, basically we were treated pretty well
Mm-hmm.
until I reported to Texas A&I and was in uniform, and there were several. And of course, in the government department, I had two friends. One I'd gone to college with here at Salmon at ROTC together, Jeff Bishop and Jack Lampy, whom I met there. And Jack and I became fast friends. We're still friends, and he lives in Uvalde. He taught at Southwest Texas Junior College, and but we're still friends. But there were a couple of people in the government department that were just really, really rotten. And this one guy named Summers. If he'd ever really spit on me, I'd have punched him out.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's Ranger training. It kicks in, and don't say it doesn't.
Right.
I mean, when you have the Ranger training and certain things happen, I almost got in trouble in the Army. When the major asked me a question, I answered it. He said, "Well, what would you have done if he had done this?" And before I could think, I'd already done it. And we picked him up off the floor. And he didn't like that because his wife and daughter saw him get embarrassed.
Right.
So yeah, and he was a major and I was a lieutenant.
Wow.
So, but it's instinctive. You just do it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's airborne school. You do it. You train until you just do it.
Right.
You don't think about it. If you have to think about it, it's too late.
Right.
Same thing with, low crawl or anything else. You just know when it's time to get down.
Right.
I could have had a Purple Heart for scratched elbows when we had a mortar round go off about as far from here to that headboard of the bed.
Mm-hmm.
And Victor Charles' ordnance is not very good sometimes. They took an 82 millimeter mortar fuse and a 60 millimeter mortar, and they used some kind of asphalt stuff to squeeze it together. And so the fuse blew and blew dirt all over us and blew the casing back that away rather than fragment.
Right.
That's the only reason I'm here.
Wow.
Al Butler, I hit, I did Ranger School. I hit the ground crawling, got out of there. My elbows were straight, and Al Butler just stood there in a trance, and we were just like this, walking together, shoulder to shoulder, and all that dirt had hit him right through there. It would have cut us in half.
Wow.
And went to the doctor, looked at my elbows. He said, "You want a Purple Heart?" I said, "No, just give me a beer."
That's funny.
I know a guy that hit a PSP and scratched his head going into the bunker and did get a Purple Heart.
Wow.
I mean, I could have had one. I didn't. If you're going to get a Purple Heart, it needs to be real. It doesn't need to be,
Right.
Just do what I was trained to do.
Right.
So I can't speak high enough about the training I had at Benny that prepared for all these things, especially Ranger School.
Right.
And the things that I learned from the instructors and the lane graders and I was prepared. I was prepared as you're going to get.
Mm-hmm.
You're never fully prepared. Had good training at Sam Houston too.
Yeah.
I mean, we had good instructors. And of course, 1,500. The year I graduated, if I'd stayed around and graduated the year I should have, I would probably been the Brigade 4 or something. But the year don't ask me how I got into that line, but anyway, the year I graduated, John Arthur McManners was a Cadet Corps commander. Of course, he retired a full colonel artillery officer. He died here a couple of years ago. John was a good friend from high school. He'd gone to school ahead of me and gone in the Army, so he got his extra years. But I mean, we had some wonderful people here, and crossed paths with several of them over the years in the Army.
Mm-hmm.
So, one of the guys, Kevin Sellers, was in the Chemical Corps, and he was down at Darmstadt. I saw him a time or two. I didn't know how where we crossed paths, but we did. And I took when I was a battalion motor officer in Germany, we took an infantry battalion and swam the Main,
What do you mean? What is?
a 13-ton M113 personnel carrier swimming the Rhine in the vehicle.
Oh wow.
Yeah, I did lose a vehicle. The general wanted a case of whiskey.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Okay, so how did like your acknowledgement for service in Vietnam? When were you acknowledged for your service for your time in Vietnam? Like how long did it take? Was it immediately after? Do you feel that?
Well, I don't know what you mean by acknowledgement. What was there to acknowledge? I went. I came home. I lived.
Okay.
You know?
Was there any acknowledgement from the government? Any sort of?
Oh no, they just sent you to another duty station or let you out.
Yeah.
And that
Even after you got out of the army?
all these things they have at the Hearts Museum, welcome back dinners and things like that.
Right.
Yeah. No, I never expected any of that.
Okay.
If I got an acknowledgement, I guess it was in May, and there's a picture of that in there, I believe, of when they awarded me the Bronze Star.
Mm-hmm. So when was that?
That was in May of '68,
Okay.
May or June. You'll see that picture. It was Colonel Peterson, my PMS, and I was assistant professor, and my first wife was there.
Okay.
So
in terms of kind of going back to like your view of the war, once you returned, or even once you got out of the army, how did you view the Vietnam and the U.S. involvement in terms of stopping communism and stuff like that? How did you
Well, I'll
perceive
tell you
that
what.
as
I
an
have a little
activity?
essay in that pocket folder called "Our Vietnam Experience,"
Mm-hmm.
and I think that's